pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth.
Well, my friends, welcome to episode 180 of Agitators Anonymous podcast. This is Alan Averill, singer in a heavy metal band. Please don't forget that. Trying to make some sense of things I do not understand. And today is a complicated podcast. I'm going to tackle something which I probably should have done a couple of weeks ago. I did a podcast just after the invasion of Ukraine about the Ukraine war, and I've tackled some difficult and I suppose reasonably, most definitely complex subjects, but perhaps none quite as complicated as this one. I'm going to talk about the Middle East in episode 180. So if you were hoping for some dumb heavy metal tour stories, you're going to have to wait a little bit. Now, fools definitely rush in to try and comment on this subject. And I've sort of held back a couple of podcasts before making some observations on it. So what I'm going to try and do is actually not put across, political polemics about, opinions about this, that, and the other, but actually look at and try an explanation of the history and why perhaps things are the way they are. As I said, the last week or two has just been listening to a lot of podcasts, rereading some passages from books, because this is a subject I was quite interested in. And I think if anybody of a certain age who grew up in the 80s and the 90s probably remembers constantly hearing about the Middle East in the news, just the same as people outside of Ireland constantly heard about the IRA. And bombings in England and bombings in the north and all this kind of stuff. It was just a constant. And Yasser Arafat's face was just ubiquitous. It was just everywhere. You constantly heard about him. And in the early 90s, you had the Oslo Peace Accords and all that kind of thing. But you grew up that every 6 to 12 to 18 months was punctuated with some kind of turmoil in the Middle East. So what I'm going to try and do is at least on my own terms, my own dumb goddamn terms, is try and unravel a little bit of the history and the reasons why some of the things are the way they are. Might be enlightening, might be useful for you, because I think the modern disease, as we've talked about many times on the podcast, is to just jump feet first in with an opinion about something, because that's what the last 10 years has done to us, the social media derangement. It has inculcated us with the principle that every thought we have, someone must know about. It must be worth something. And, of course, after the attacks on the October the 7th, the amount of people who just jumped in with opinions 1, 2, 3, 4 hours after, it wasn't even possible to know properly what had happened. And also, the horror of what happened hadn't quite unfolded yet. And so many people just jumped to what we could consider ill-informed opinions. Personally, I held my counsel trying to figure out what was going on, and try and at least have some sort of understanding of the region. I think back to books I read, Robert Fisk's book, A History of the Middle East, and all the Shah's men, and trying to understand the history of the Middle East is so complicated. It's the same thing, I suppose, when somebody, most Irish people have been there in a bar somewhere on the east coast of America, maybe it's Boston or New York, and you've met somebody who says, oh, I'm Irish, and I'm Irish, and it gets onto the Troubles and it gets onto stuff about the North, and you probably know, you've probably heard opinions from people, and you've literally fucking taking your hat off and going like, sorry, hang on, what? Wait, that's what you think? Okay, just let's fucking stall the digger there, pull the stopper, or whatever it is that they say, and go, look, here's the story, here's the history. It goes back 800 years. You've got to start mentioning William of Orange. You start going into all this stuff. Every Irish person has been there. Every Irish person has been there after 3 or 4 years, trying to somehow grapple with the complexities of Irish history, as I've done on the podcast. There are a few, if you go back some episodes, the famine and all sorts of stuff. The more recent one, the famine, but the repercussions of the famine. So all of these, every historical, every modern context has like a historical stone has been dropped in the lake, and the ripples keep spreading out, and ripples of events that happened 2,000 years ago, which is where we're going to start with this, are still being felt in the Middle East. That's how far all of this is going back. And that's got to change a lot of the knee-jerk reactions and modern contextualizations that we try and place on this without understanding the history. So it's not going to be, this is the first part of this. I might get to my opinions at the end of it. So if you're waiting for the juicy hot takes, you're going to have to wait and listen to the end. But I think this podcast is mainly going to be an observation of the history. I hope it's of some kind of use to you. The podcast, as ever, is sponsored by Metal Blade Records. By now, you've, of course, bought the new Primordial. I presume you have, in one of the many myriad of colours that are available on the vinyl. And you are using that code AA2023 over at indiemerch.com. Just follow the links underneath. If you're out there with a band, and you're thinking to yourself, we really need a cool backdrop, then get in touch with me. I can put you in touch with the people. From next week on, I'm going to start again with a sponsored ad read by an Irish band. It feels maybe the wrong podcast today to kind of interject into the middle of such serious history with, an ad for a band playing in the background. So I might put that off until next week. We'll see. I might give you a preview of the song at the end. So I'm trying to get you to get to the end of the podcast. I know I'm part of the attention economy, but it is the way it is. So with all due respects to said band, we'll see if we get there. If not, it will definitely be in next week's slightly, maybe less heavy duty podcast. So let's tread carefully. I have friends on both sides of the divide. I have friends from Israel. We have played with bands from Israel. Actually, I was with a very good friend of mine from Israel, Tal, on October the 7th, and we discussed all of this stuff at length. I have friends who are Arabs. I have friends who are Muslims. I play football with many of those people as well, etc., etc. Does that need saying? I don't know. But I will try and say that between both sets of the people that I know, I've had discussions about this problem. And it's complicated. God damn, it's complicated. But today's podcast is going to try and, with an objective view and a kind of, very middle of the road, or some may say fence sitting, i.e. because it's not full of, acerbic opinion and hot takes. It's just maybe an explanation of some historical facts that maybe can be of use to and put some context on the situation. Now, the first thing I'll say is this, and I said this a couple of weeks ago to somebody. I said it in the podcast, and I said it to somebody I was discussing this with a month ago or so. I said, well, in the Bible, such and such and such, and they looked at me with 10 heads, like, because they're part of this modern, secular, atheist Western mindset, which I understand. I said, well, in the Bible, there's tribes of this, and there's geographical claims to this and the other. And they were looking at me with 10 heads. And I said, look, the Bible was written at a time by people, and it's set in a time of, it's got a historical timeline. There are actual factual figures in it. Now, of course, I'm not asking you to believe the fishes and loaves and walking on water and all the parables and all that kind of stuff. But if you've ever actually looked at the Bible, it's full of historical stuff. And that's where this history starts. This is where it starts, because about 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Now, you think Irish history is complicated when we go back 850 years ago. But 2,000 years ago, in the region of the Middle East, many people, many tribes, Israelis were displaced by the Romans. Yes, the Roman Empire. Go and watch The Life of Brian for your historical examples. But they were displaced by the Romans. And they were tribes moved to Iraq, to what is modern day Iraq, to Yemen, moved to Central Europe, and there began to form Jewish Israeli communities all around the place. Spain, Portugal, and that first displacement, because these are words, I'm going to be careful with my words here, because this podcast is not intended to put either side of the argument with judgment, just to try and present some historical facts and context. And that's the kind of first displacement of peoples in the region. Well, I shouldn't say the first, but it's a displacement of the peoples in the region. That is at the behest of the Roman Empire. If you want to go and take, I think I did a podcast about the killing of Caesar or something, maybe 100-odd episodes ago, sometime in 1971 or something like that. But that's the start. So when people, just want to say in relation to that, so people say, well, the history of Israel starts after the Second World War. This is not true. It's not true. It's a common misconception. So anyway, I'm not going to try and explain the history of the end of the end of the Roman Empire up to the present day. But let's fast forward almost 1,880 years, precisely 1,897 years, because this is the formation of the Zionist movement by a guy called Theodor Herzl. And the principle of the Zionist movement was to the re-establishment of a state of Israel. And the reasons for that were that there were organized pogroms. And what a pogrom is an organized massacre of an ethnic group. A pogrom. And they were mainly in Russia in the 1880s against the Jews and across Eastern Europe. So again, another historical concept that perhaps you haven't thought of. But these were the very first pogroms in the 1880s. Many people, after these pogroms, left to the USA. And they left to a moment in the USA that I think is very interesting. And I think, look, this is Agitators Anonymous, so I'm going to kind of, go all over the place a little bit. But we are going to, many Jews are fleeing to the USA around this time, 1880, 1890. And this is to a period in American history which is called the Gilded Age. And I think this is quite important, actually. I sense it is. And the Gilded Age sort of refers to a period in American history during the late 19th century, from 1870 to the early 1900s. And it was coined by Mark Twain and a guy called Charles Dudley Warner in their novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And the term gilded suggests, I think, an outwardly golden and prosperous facade that masks deeper social issues and inequalities. But it's the era of city building. And during this era, the United States experienced, I think, significant economic growth, industrialization, and technological advancements. And, I think some of the people who were fleeing those pogroms just sort of settled into this period in American history and became very influential in that period of history. I'm talking about like the Carnegies of this world and that kind of thing. Although he hadn't fled a pogrom, but you know what I mean. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, anyway. However, alongside the prosperity, there were profound social problems, including like corruption, labor struggles, all that kind of thing. The Gilded Age, though, was characterized by rapid industrial expansion in America at the time. I just thought that would be an interesting aside to the moment when people were moving from those pogroms. And they were coming into a time of great growth in America. And I think that many Jews who moved to the USA kind of prospered in that situation. I feel like I've sort of skipped over the Middle Ages and the Rothschilds, and like even when you read Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice, maybe I'll come back to that. And the reason I'll come back to that is because I'm about to read a declaration. So we're kind of moving through history. So this is 1917. This is after the First World War, after the horrors of the First World War. A declaration called the Balfour Declaration, which is a crazy thing. And I've tried to wrap many people far cleverer than I, in fact, most people far cleverer than I, have tried to wrap their heads around how this declaration came to be bashed out in a dark room over cigars and brandy in London by some men who had never even been to the Middle East and some men who had. And their background, Christian Zionists. I'm going to explain that in a minute. But the Balfour Declaration is kind of one of the main reasons why we are in the situation we are in right now in the Middle East. So I'm going to actually read it for you. So the Balfour Declaration, this is signed by the Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. And it states, "Dear Lord Rothschild," yep, indeed, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." And that is the letter from Lord Balfour. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. Yeah, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary. So what this document basically seems to do is it promises two separate things that are two separate things to two separate peoples, or at least it seems incongruous. It seems like it's an impossible promise. But there's one kind of extra side angle to this, and that is that some of these people who created this declaration were Christian Zionists. Now, this kind of takes on some sort of extra premise when you've probably seen, I think Louis Theroux did a documentary where he went to Israel and he met Christian Zionists, and they were like, it's a tourist thing. Americans go to see, you know, where the Battle of Megiddo in the Bible, I think, will take place, and they believe in they believe in biblical prophecy, and that the hastening of the Jews to Zion will bring about the second coming and all this kind of stuff. And some of these people who wrote this declaration, this was kind of what they believed in. So Christian Zionists, individuals or groups within the Christian community who supported the establishment and continuation of a Jewish homeland in Israel. And it was often based on their interpretation of biblical prophecy. And they believed in the significance of Israel, in the fulfillment of that biblical prophecy. God, I'm having trouble with my words today. And see the return of the Jews to the Holy Land as a crucial step towards the realization of these prophecies. So you can see this religious ideology was set to the backdrop of the Balfour Declaration. It has various theological, political, and cultural expressions, focusing on biblical passages from the Old Testament, such as the promises to Abraham and the prophecies of the restoration of Israel. Yeah, like I said, Old Testament stuff. And some aligned their support with political ideologies and geopolitical developments in the Middle East. Complicated stuff, right? So while Christian, it's not like a sort of monolithic movement, and it was something along the lines of, it was very popular among many people at the end of the 19th century. And I think it feels to me like it can be set to the backdrop of an awful lot of the sort of Victorian and post-Victorian sort of religious movements that swept through the upper echelons of sort of educated society, which we find very strange now. But so the Balfour Declaration basically set in motion the promises to the Zionist movement of the establishment of a state of Israel, but also at the same time stating that it shouldn't infringe on any of the rights of the people on the land already, which seems like two things that are incompatible. So as you can see, what we're talking about are biblical claims, because the Romans, as you know, they played a starring role in the Bible, Pontius Pilate and all that kind of stuff. But of course, in the 2,000 years since the old Bible was written, or however, whatever way you believe it, since the old story went down on pen to paper, and the region, of course, I'm not going to use the word occupied, but just people lived in this region. And those were Arab and Muslim communities. I mean, this is entirely natural. I'm talking about a span of 2,000 years. I mean, the Quran, I think, was written in the 9th century, so it's natural. There are many, many peoples who just live in this area. But if we can fast forward now to... hang on. Let's not fast forward just yet. So we're in the post-World War II moment. And, this is an era where the British Empire is sort of falling apart. It's relinquishing control or it's in the process of falling apart. And in the post-World War II, post-Balfour Declaration 1917, Jews start moving back to the area, to this. And at the beginning, the British are trying to have a sort of balanced mandate, but this sort of relinquishes itself to civil war in the region. The Balfour Declaration is sort of baffling, and if I could do a podcast all about the Balfour Declaration, but there are, again, far better historians than far cleverer people who've sort of tried to look into it. But it just seems like a baffling document, and the background to it, and how these two sort of like colonial adventurers, sort of boys' own characters, who says history is like Lawrence of Arabia types who are just out looking for adventure. Set to a sort of religious fervour, who end up making this document. And it doesn't really seem to have been exactly had much oversight or overview by enough people. Doesn't seem to have been a huge input from many other politicians. This is the period of time where you have Prime Ministers Asquith, who I think he left in, or he was displaced in 1915. But David Lloyd George had some element of influence over the Balfour Declaration, and he sort of favoured partition of the empire. But it probably hasn't escaped your attention that the letter is addressed to Lord Rothschild. Make of that what you will, because that's a name that's kind of it's a very contentious name in history, where some people believe that if you mention that name, it's part of some conspiracy theory. But they were real people. They were a real family, and they had real influence. Niall Ferguson has a book, I can't remember the name, Civilization, I think, which has a very great chapter on their influence in the 16th and 17th, maybe 17th and 18th centuries. Anyway, that's not really the point. Go and look it up if and avoid the sort of, like I said, the conspiracy theorist polemic angles of the furthest reaches of the discussion. But they're real people, obviously, and this Balfour Declaration is addressed to a Lord Rothschild. But one thing is for sure, this Balfour Declaration kind of just poured. It's an impossible document that seems to make, a kind of ill-informed sense when you really begin to look into it. Anyway, so where are we? The British are essentially stuck in the middle of a situation now, which they helped create, which doesn't seem to have any sort of practical endgame. Now, we get to World War II. And, what can you say? The Holocaust. Over 6 million European Jews killed. And if you've ever visited Auschwitz, it's a very, very sobering experience. If you haven't, and you're busy posting pictures of hang gliders on your social media, you should maybe rein your neck in. I certainly think so. And maybe take a little bit more time from posting memes and do a little bit more digging into history. Anyway, there's one saucy hot take. And look, this is where a lot of people's understanding of the history seems to come from. Of course, I'm trying to sort of place it in context, but in 1948, a man called David Ben-Gurion is a sort of very famous figure, and there's sort of large numbers in this post-Second World War state start to set up the setting up. Come on, brain. The setting up of the State of Israel happens in 1948. There is also the contentious, NABCA. I mean, again, an episode I don't know a hell of a lot about, but this is the sort of ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. I'm beginning to sweat a bit over some of these sentences because I realize I'm straying into some very dark and complicated history. But, like I said, just give me a little leeway here as I'm trying to sort of navigate through very, very choppy waters. Anyway, 1948 is the year. And this newly founded State of Israel is recognized by the international community and the United Nations and all that kind of thing. And this is for about 19, 20 years. I'm going to move ahead to the 1967, the Six-Day War. But this is sort of the establishment of recognized borders and a newly created state of Israel recognized by the international community. Of course, communities within those territories are displaced or moved. But again, considering what happened in the Second World War and the implications of the Second World War, there really was no way that this state was not going to be established, at least in my simplistic understanding of the situation. So 1967, let's fast forward to there a little bit. Israel was attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Jordan just afterwards. And this is quite a famous war. It's a sort of 6 day. In 6 days, the Israeli army defeated all of those. And it's a sort of very important victory in this area. And I think heralded a very great power balance. Understanding a power shift maybe in the region. But it is also very important to note that after this war, Israel took territory that was beyond the 1948 recognized borders. And this is very important, and this is really is part of where we are today. And because those two territories were Gaza, which belonged at the time to Egypt, and the West Bank, which belonged to Jordan. So these were essentially occupied territories after 1967 war. Again, people will argue about those words, but I'm really just trying to tell the sort of historical timeline here. So tensions simmer, of course they do. And in 1973, and this is one of the crazy things, is that we have the Yom Kippur War, which is more or less between most of the same actors. But the October 7th attacks were more or less the 50th anniversary of that Yom Kippur War. And that's what's so surprising, that the symbolism, symbolism on the calendar seemed to be sort of lost in the mix somewhere. It seemed, this sort of... let's say I think that modern Israeli politics in the last couple of years has been focused internally on dealing with the different fractions in a government that's been pulled and pushed by right-wing populist elements and all that kind of thing. And so maybe attentions were focused internally as opposed to externally. So let's fast forward a little bit to the 1990s, and we have the Oslo Peace Accord, which is very interesting. And I think that, let's say, for example, instead of murder and slaughter that happened on October the 7th, if there had been a famous peace accord which had brought peace, further peace to the region, I don't think the same people who were whooping and celebrating this attack and slaughter would have been whooping and celebrating a peace accord, because it's just not quite as sexy, is it? No, not really. But again, if you grew up and you're of a certain age, then the face of Yasser Arafat was everywhere, and he was very famous at this time. And the Oslo Peace Accord was basically the idea that there was a two-state solution, that in the process of time the Palestinians will be granted their own state. Now the problem, of course, is that Gaza and the West Bank are not joined together. Geographically, you should look at a map, because even though the West Bank suggests that it's on the west near the coast, it's not. It's sort of east inward of land, and Gaza is a strip along the ocean. They're not joined together. And it's sort of stated that boundaries would be reset, but there had been hundreds of enclaves and settlements since then, and disputes over settling on land that was outside of the original borders. That's an awful lot of what this problem is about as well. And so the Oslo Peace Accords, I remember at the time reading a lot about it as a sort of teenager. I was a quite sort of teenager who was less interested in what was going on in school, but more interested in what was going on in the news and geopolitics, and reading books about, in some cases, the Middle East and all that kind of stuff. And I think one of the things that's very striking about the modern geopolitical world setting, or let's say European setting, is the lack of statesmen or stateswomen, or of powerful figures who are able to move the hands of history. If you think about some of the people whether it was Reagan, whether it was Thatcher, whether it was Mitterrand, there's very great, even I suppose Merkel was the last powerful stateswoman in Europe. If you think of who we have now in charge across Europe, I mean, what are we doing? Are we asking Rishi Sunak to bring people to the table in the Middle East? I mean, the news seemed to suggest that Boris Johnson sunk a peace, talks between Ukraine and Russia. I don't know, maybe he was getting... Well, no, can I say that? And on the part, let's just leave that alone. Let's just park that opinion. But are we relying on Macron? Macron and sort of, the sort of elder brother of the likes of Trudeau and stuff, to sit the parties down around the Middle East and bring some sort of peace settlement. It just seems like the lack of... I often bemoan this in Irish politics as well, that there's the likes of a Garrett Fitzgerald. If you're from Ireland, you'll know who he was. These people are John Hume, who helped bring around the Northern Ireland peace process, amongst many other people. These statesmen, love or loathe Blair, I suppose at the time he had an influence on this. In the 90s, it was Clinton. There was a very great focus on the Middle East. I think it's because people understood that the tensions there could flare up and cause literally a conflagration that would engulf an awful lot of the world. And that's where we're on the precipice of right now. But I'm not sure if I'm going to get to that in this podcast. Maybe that's for another podcast. But so the 1990 peace accords kind of herald a form of uneasy peace. Let's say that. But Arafat's party, Fatah, Gaza is, ruled by... Let's fast forward to 2004-5, and Israel withdraw from Gaza and hand it over to Palestine control. And kind of what happens almost immediately is that Hamas, a sort of radical terrorist group, takes over the Gaza Strip. And you've got Palestine is divided because you've got Gaza is ruled by Hamas and the West Bank is ruled by Fatah. Fatah is Arafat's party. And look, I mean, that was part of the problem, and I said it on the podcast, with many people now marching across Europe with sort of liberal-minded, new left kind of people with, very sort of open, progressive views. You see queers for Palestine flags and this and that and the other, marching beside people who are carrying ISIS flags, who are clearly looking at them going, look at these useful idiots. Because under, Hamas, okay, it ain't quite ISIS. Okay, here's a saucy hot take on 32 minutes. But it's clear that they are, opposed not only to the very existence of Israel, and you saw the savage butchery they wielded out to just any Jews who they came across, but also they're fundamentally against the West. They're against your liberal principles. So going out and marching, waving flags, is just the cognitive dissonance involved in supporting people who would wish you death is beyond me. But anyway, there's your saucy hot take on 33 minutes, and I don't think it's really that saucy. But anyway, so they withdraw from Gaza, and that's sort of where I'm going to leave the idea, the kind of historical background. A lot of it is to do with biblical claims, the Roman Empire, the pogroms of the 1880s in Eastern Europe and Russia, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and then, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War. I mean, and of course, I don't want to appear one-sided. You've got the displacement of, Palestinians as well. They have a right to a homeland, to their own self-determination, to respect and dignity, and all those kind of things, and a democratic political process, I guess, and right now the levelling of Gaza does no one any good. There seems to be no plan for what to do afterwards, and the humanitarian crisis there as it's unfolding is unspeakable as well. I mean, it's just, all of this is just an incredibly dark moment in modern history, which just seems to echo so many things from the past. It's got so many dark and complicated coefficients going in to make to create the moment we are in as a society now. And the very great risk is that this broadens out into a conflict between some elements who have nuclear capability and don't, I suppose. But you're going to start to see Hezbollah, who are another group in southern Lebanon, sponsored by Iran. I mean, has this entire thing been created because the Iranian mullahs were observing the Saudi Accords, where Israel was about to sort of make peace with Saudi Arabia, and they were trying to torpedo that? I mean, there's so many potential things happening here. The leaders of Hamas, I think, reside in Qatar, you know, where that old World Cup was, where Messi won the World Cup and completed football. Yeah, is your brain spinning yet? And it was only just days before the attacks that Jake Sullivan, the US advisor, I think, to the Middle East, in Biden's staff, said, never has the Middle East been so peaceful. Famous last words. So it's an incredibly complicated situation, and I just would not advise, but just say people try and have a little look into the history before making pronounced statements, because it seems to me like the cognitive dissonance involved in, you know, some of the same people who are like pro-lockdown, save every life, then seeming to celebrate or revel in murder on another level, seemed to me to be a crazy thing, and it seemed to me to be an incredible hypocrisy. I understand that it fed into all of the tribalism of modern internet society, and it is possible, of course, to want a better life for Palestinian people living in a kind of blockade society, in a sort of open prison society, want a better life for them, but also want Israel to be able to protect its citizens and have security. And nobody wants murder. Murder is murder. Death is death. And so you can support the principle of 2, 3, 4, 5 separate different things. And that's the problem, and I've said it so many times on the podcast, that modern tribal internet culture wants us to view everything in a binary. It's good or evil. And that nuance and context are not important, or they just get in the way of your hot take. And look, I've thrown out a few little, I don't think they're really even hot takes, but the world should be paying attention to what's happening, because if Hezbollah starts attacking from southern Lebanon, let's say Israel bombs Iran, backed by the US, who backs Iran, well, now we're looking at Putin and Russia, and you are looking at a conflict that could expand beyond the proxy nature of the original Cold War geopolitics. Because I think people want to place a very simplistic structure over this. They either want to say Palestine's good, Israeli bad, and place it in the context of colony and empire, or try and place kind of modern American cultural war issues and just neatly place them over a region where, as you've just listened to in this podcast, we're going back to biblical history. It just doesn't work like that, and it's a fool's errand to try and do so. I mean, can you do a deal with a death cult? Can you do a deal with people who believe in biblical and religious prophecy? Can you do a deal with people who believe that paradise waits for them after this life? Not sure we have a statesman alive who could really bring all of these parties to the table. But here we are. Agitators Anonymous, episode 180, is my perhaps foolhardy attempt to bring some levity or understanding or historical understanding or context to to what's happening in the Middle East. There's a few saucy hot takes in there, but that's not really what this is about. I would just really advise or really recommend just having a look into the madness of the Balfour Declaration, and this will and also look into the pogroms of the 1880s. And pogroms of the 1880s and the Balfour Declaration of 1917, just take a look at those things and who the people were sitting around the table, and you begin to get some little bit more context of what's happening. All right, my friends, perhaps it may be the last podcast I ever do. Who knows? Episode 180. We shall see you next week, and I will have that sponsorship by a band next week. You can hear some of that, and we'll see you on the other side, my friends.